They said ours was a marriage built on stability, a house with walls that would never crumble. For years I believed it too. Friends envied us, whispering about how lucky I was to have Daniel. Calm, reliable, successful. On the outside, we were picture perfect. Inside, though, the silence had begun to rot us from within. At first, it was subtle. A missed smile across the dinner table, a conversation cut short. Daniel used to fill our evenings with stories from work, quiet jokes only I understood, and a steady hand on mine when I drifted into worry. Lately, though, his eyes carried shadows I could not name. His voice, when it came, was clipped. His words like stones dropped in water, heavy, sinking. Gone before I could catch them. I told myself every marriage ebbs and flows, that love can exist even in stillness. But this wasn't stillness. This was withdrawal. His gaze sometimes lingered on me as though I were a stranger trespassing in his home. And when I asked gently what was wrong, his reply was nothing at all, nothing, always nothing. That word began to haunt me. Nothing became the lock on his phone, the late nights he excused as work, the distance in his bed. Nothing pressed against my chest in the dark hours when sleep refused to come. I wanted to believe it was stress, or fatigue, or something I could fix if I tried hard enough. But the silence was not temporary. It was deliberate, sharpened into a weapon I could not defend myself against. And as I stared at him across another cold dinner, I realized something unspoken was growing between us. Something dangerous, something waiting to break. The silence did not fade. It thickened. Each day Daniel grew more distant, his presence in the house a shadow that no longer touched me. I began to notice things I once ignored. The way his phone never left his side. The sharp glance he cast at me if I reached too close to it. The way his face tightened when a message arrived late at night. One evening, as I stirred soup on the stove, I heard the faint murmur of his voice from the study. Daniel never made calls at home. My hand froze on the ladle, heart hammering. I moved closer, straining to catch words, but all I heard was the low rhythm of his voice. Steady, intimate, secretive. The moment I stepped into the hall, the call ended. Who was that? I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me with those flat eyes, unreadable. Work. The word landed like a blade, simple, final. A wall between us I could not climb, but work never called after midnight. Work didn't make him slip out of bed, careful not to wake me, returning hours later with no explanation. Work didn't leave the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt. Sleep abandoned me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his footsteps downstairs, the door creaking, the car engine sparking to life. My mind raced through every possibility. Another woman, a hidden debt, something darker. The silence offered no answers. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home. Every whisper of his phone, every unexplained absence, every dismissive shrug scraped at my sanity. The silence was no longer absence. It was accusation, screaming at me in a language only my heart understood. One night, when he returned with bloodshot eyes and an expression I could not decipher, I finally confronted him. His reply was the same as always, sharp and cutting. Stop imagining things. And with those words, the silence turned into something else entirely. A weapon meant to break me. His words struck me like glass shattering across the floor. Stop imagining things. The way he said it, sharp, cold final, made my chest tighten. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I followed him into the living room, anger boiling beneath my skin. Daniel, I'm not imagining the phone calls, the late nights, the perfume. Do you think I'm blind? He didn't look at me. He sat down, loosening his tie as though I were nothing more than background noise. That silence again, thick and unyielding. Answer me. My voice broke through the stillness. Finally, he turned his gaze on me. Not with love, not even with pity, but with irritation. Elena, you've been paranoid for months. You twist everything into some conspiracy. You want me to admit to something that doesn't exist, just so your insecurities can rest. The words stung because they were delivered with such calm certainty, gaslighting at its cruelest, making me question what I knew I had seen. Smelled, heard. I know what's real, I whispered. But doubt crept into my voice. He leaned closer, his tone lowering into something almost dangerous. Do you? Or have you lost yourself in your little fantasies? You're suffocating this marriage with suspicion. For a fleeting second, I thought he might strike me. His hand twitched at his side, his jaw tightened, and the tension between us thickened like smoke. Instead, he stood and walked past me, brushing my shoulder hard enough to sting. I stood frozen, trembling, questioning myself. Was I truly losing my mind? Or was he carefully dismantling my sense of reality, one denial at a time? That night I sat alone in the dark, every sound of the house pressing against me, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the distant ticking of the clock. Each reminded me that Daniel had created a prison without walls, and yet beneath all the fear, one thought burned. Silence could no longer be my answer. If I didn't uncover the truth, it would consume me whole. Little did I know. The truth was already closer than I imagined, and soon, another presence would step into our fractured marriage. After that night, the tension between us became unbearable. Daniel's silence carved hollows inside me, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed against every wall of our home. I told myself I needed answers, even if they cut me open. That was when Claire appeared again. She had always been a presence in our lives, a family friend, someone who joined dinners occasionally, her laughter filling spaces where Daniel's voice had grown scarce. But now she seemed to appear more often, too often, dropping by with excuses of sharing a recipe, or bringing a book Daniel had apparently asked for. The first time I noticed, it was small. The way Daniel's eyes lit faintly when she entered, a softness I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He didn't speak much to her, but his silence toward her felt different. Not cold, but comfortable, familiar. I began to watch them carefully, every gesture sharpening into evidence. The slight lean of her body toward his, the way his hand lingered an extra second when he took a dish from her. My heart whispered what my mind dreaded. She was the third shadow in our marriage. When I confronted him, his response was as cruel as ever. Claire's a friend. You twist everything? Is there anyone you don't suspect? His tone dismissed me, his silence afterward sealing the accusation that I was unstable. Yet, in that very dismissal, I felt truth bleeding through. He never denied the closeness, never assured me, never reached for me the way he once had. Claire's presence became unbearable. Every visit felt like an intrusion, each smile she cast at Daniel a knife in my chest. I started searching for signs, receipts, messages, anything to prove my instincts weren't madness. But instead of answers, I found only more questions, more shadows. And one evening, as the house echoed with silence again, I realized shadows have weight, and sometimes they bleed. The night it happened, the house felt unusually still. Daniel had been brooding in the study for hours, the door shut firmly between us. Claire's visit earlier still lingered in my mind like a sour taste. I tried to distract myself, folding laundry, tidying the kitchen, but unease coiled tightly in my chest. Then it came, a scream. Sharp, piercing, not from outside but from within. It shattered the silence like glass exploding. My body froze, then moved before thought could catch up. I ran down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. The study door was half open. What I saw inside burned into me like a brand. Daniel lay crumpled on the carpet, his body twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and spreading fast, staining the beige fibers into something grotesque. His chest rose faintly, but his face was pale, lips slack. The phone slipped from my trembling hand as I gasped. For a moment I couldn't even move. The air smelled of iron, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced with questions. What happened? Did he fall? Did someone? But the room was empty except for us. Daniel, I screamed, rushing to him. My hands hovered, unsure whether to touch the blood, whether to move him. Panic clawed up my throat. With shaking fingers, I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency services, stumbling through my words. When the neighbors arrived, drawn by my scream, they found me crouched on the floor, phone pressed to my ear. My hands smeared red, though I'd barely touched him. Their eyes widened, fear and suspicion mingling as they took in the scene. He's unconscious, I kept saying, my voice breaking. I just found him like this. I don't know what happened. But even as the words left me, I felt the weight of them, brittle, unconvincing. Because I was the only one in the house. Because my marriage had already been cracked by silence, suspicion, and shadows. The paramedics stormed in, voices urgent, movements sharp. They lifted Daniel, blood still staining his hair, and rushed him away. I stood there, hollow, neighbors' stares burning into me. I thought the nightmare would end once help arrived. I was wrong. That moment was only the beginning. Because in the hours that followed, I would no longer be seen as the desperate wife. I would be seen as the suspect. The hospital lights had barely faded from my eyes when I was escorted into a small, windowless room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A metal table divided me from the detectives, its surface reflecting the harsh overhead bulb. My hands, still trembling, rested flat against the cold steel. Detective Harris entered last. Tall, deliberate, his gaze cut through me like he'd already decided who I was. He sat across from me, opening a file with calm precision. "Mrs. Carter," he began, voice measured. "Tell us what happened tonight." I repeated the story I had told the paramedics, my voice uneven. Daniel in the study, the scream, finding him on the floor, calling for help. But as the words left my lips, they sounded fragile, as though they belonged to someone else. Harris leaned forward. "You said you heard him scream, correct?" "Yes." But when paramedics arrived, his injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. Fall. Unlikely he could have screamed after that. "How do you explain it?" My mouth went dry. I stammered, trying to fill the silence. "I must have imagined, or maybe he imagined." His brow arched, skepticism heavy. "Your neighbors reported hearing you scream, not him." Each word tightened the noose around me. My memory faltered, spinning between panic and fragments of truth. I clung to the version that kept me safe, but it was already slipping through my fingers. "Did you and your husband argue tonight?" Harris asked, voice sharper now. I hesitated. Admitting the fights meant admitting motive. Denying them made me a liar. "We've had disagreements," I whispered. The silence that followed was unbearable. His pen tapped against the table, steady, deliberate. Each click a judgment. Finally, Harris leaned back. "Your husband's alive, but he hasn't spoken a word since he was brought in. He can't or won't. Until he does, we only have your word." The door opened, the session ending, but the echo of his words stayed with me. Daniel's silence had followed me here. And in that silence, I was already guilty. Daniel lived. That should have been my relief, my salvation. But when I entered his hospital room, hope collapsed under the weight of his eyes. He looked at me, pale and frail against the white sheets, yet said nothing. Not a word, not even a whisper. "Daniel," I begged softly, stepping closer. "Please tell them. Tell them I didn't do this." His gaze followed me, steady but unreadable. His lips remained closed, his silence an impenetrable wall. Nurses came and went, adjusting tubes and machines. But still he lay there, mute, as if my presence required no response. Days passed, and still no testimony. Doctors claimed his vocal cords were uninjured. His silence wasn't medical, it was choice. In the courtroom, that silence became its own testimony. The prosecutor twisted it into a weapon. If she were innocent, why would her husband refuse to defend her? Why does he stay silent in her presence but answer doctors' commands? The words cut deeper than any blade. My chest tightened as the jury's eyes fell on me. Their suspicion thick, their judgment building. Daniel's silence echoed louder than any accusation. At night, I replayed everything in my mind. Had I misjudged him all along? Was this his revenge? His punishment for the cracks in our marriage? Or worse, was he hiding something only his silence could protect? When Claire appeared in court, sitting quietly at the back, I caught the faintest flicker in Daniel's eyes. Recognition, familiarity. Something unspoken passed between them. And the knife twisted deeper inside me. I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased. Detective Harris leaned close after one hearing, his voice low but cutting. "Silence can be louder than words, Mrs. Carter. And right now, his silence condemns you." I felt my world tightening, the walls closing in. Daniel, once my partner, my anchor, now held the key to my freedom and refused to use it. And so I waited, trapped in the cruelest prison of all. A marriage where silence had become a sentence. The courtroom became less a place of justice and more a stage where my life was torn apart piece by piece. With Daniel silent and unmoving, The prosecution built their story brick by brick, and they built it out of my past. It began with whispers of an old relationship I had buried long ago. Mark, my ex. Violent, manipulative, the man I had barely escaped years earlier. His name alone sent a chill down my spine when the prosecutor uttered it. They called it a pattern of violence, implying I had absorbed his darkness instead of surviving it. One of Daniel's colleagues testified next. She had a temper, he said firmly, eyes avoiding mine. I've seen her snap at Daniel in public. If that's what she showed strangers, imagine what happened behind closed doors. Another voice followed, a friend who once comforted me during a fight with Daniel. Elena was volatile, she admitted, regret flickering in her gaze. She could be intense. Each testimony twisted reality, pulling isolated moments out of context until they formed a portrait of me I did not recognize. Angry, dangerous, manipulative. The jury leaned forward with every word, their expressions hardening. I wanted to scream that none of it was true, that surviving an abusive man didn't make me an abuser. I wanted to say that my anger came from fear, from loneliness, from years of silence cutting into my skin like glass. But my words were drowned beneath the weight of their narrative, and through it all, Daniel sat in silence. His stillness was the final nail, reinforcing their story without him ever speaking a word. By the end of that day, I was no longer Elena Carter, the wife desperate for answers. I had become the villain in their story. A woman with motive, with history, with fire in her veins that, according to them, had finally exploded. As I sat shackled by both law and memory, I realized this was not just a trial of a crime. It was a trial of me, of my entire existence, and the worst part was yet to come. The prison walls closed in like a second skin, gray, unyielding, suffocating. Nights were the worst. The silence here was different from Daniel's. It wasn't sharp or purposeful, just empty. Yet within that emptiness, memories crept in like ghosts. I replayed them, one by one, until they formed a clearer picture than I had ever dared to see while inside our home. The way Daniel withheld affection when I disagreed with him. The way his gaze could reduce me to doubt without him speaking a single word. How he'd vanish into silence for days after a conflict, forcing me to crawl back, apologizing for sins I hadn't committed, begging just to feel warmth again. That was his power. Not shouting, not striking, silence. A punishment more brutal than any blow. It had hollowed me out, year by year, until I doubted my own voice, my own mind. I remembered the time I confronted him about Claire, trembling but certain. He'd only smiled faintly, said, "If you keep inventing lies, soon you won't know what's real." I laughed nervously then, thinking he was teasing. But now in this cell, I saw it for what it was, gaslighting so perfect it made me question my own sanity. The realization shattered me. Tears came hot and relentless, but behind them was rage. Rage at myself for not seeing it sooner, rage at him for building a cage out of silence and calling it marriage. Daniel hadn't just withdrawn. He had orchestrated my unraveling. Every withheld word, every cold stare, every dismissive shrug was a calculated strike. His silence was not absence. It was dominance. I pressed my palms to the cold wall, whispering to the darkness, it was never nothing. It was always something. It was always him. For the first time, clarity cut through the fog. Yet clarity did not bring freedom. It only deepened the dread of what awaited me. Because if silence was his greatest weapon, then in the courtroom, where every word mattered, his silence would destroy me completely. The courtroom air was thick, every breath heavy with judgment. I sat at the defense table, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. My lawyer whispered strategy in my ear, but his words were muffled, distant, swallowed by the pounding in my chest. All I could see was Daniel. He sat a few rows back, posture straight, face carved from stone. No emotion, no flicker of recognition, not even when my eyes searched his desperately. His silence filled the room louder than the murmurs of the crowd. The judge's voice rang out. Has the jury reached a verdict? A foreman stood, paper trembling only slightly in his grasp. We have, Your Honor. The pause that followed seemed endless. My heartbeat slowed, then quickened, a cruel rhythm of dread. We, the jury, find the defendant, Elena Carter. He hesitated, eyes flicking briefly toward me. Guilty. The word detonated inside me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a hushed silence heavy with finality. My body lurched forward as if struck. No! My scream tore from me before I could stop it. I didn't do this. You're wrong. Guards closed in, their grip firm on my arms as I thrashed against them. Tears blurred my vision, but through the haze I saw him. Daniel, still silent, still watching. Not a tear, not a protest. Just that cold, impenetrable mask. Daniel, I cried, my voice cracking, desperate. Say something. Tell them the truth. But he didn't, he never did. His silence was the verdict's echo, sealing my fate more completely than the jury's words ever could. As they dragged me from the courtroom, the walls seemed to close in, the noise of the crowd fading into a distant roar. My screams bounced against the marble, reverberating into emptiness. And still, he remained unmoved, watching, silent. That silence would haunt me long after the cell doors clanged shut. But I didn't yet know that silence held more than betrayal. It held secrets. Secrets that would soon surface and twist the truth into something darker than I ever imagined. The cell was cold, the walls pressing in like silent witnesses to my downfall. Every night I replayed the trial, the verdict, Daniel's unflinching silence. But what I didn't know was that outside those prison walls, truths were beginning to stir. Detective Harris had never been satisfied. He sat in his cluttered office, staring at photographs, statements, timelines. Something about Daniel's role gnawed at him. Why would a husband refuse to testify, neither condemning nor saving his wife? Silence was rarely neutral. It was choice. A week after my sentencing, Harris received a file from a junior officer. Bank transactions, receipts, security footage. At first glance, ordinary. But when lined up, a darker picture emerged. Daniel had purchased supplies weeks before the night of the attack. Cleaning agents, a knife identical to the one used. Gloves that were never found. Harris leaned back, realization washing over him. The pieces fit too neatly. Daniel hadn't been the passive victim. He had orchestrated the stage, setting the scene, ensuring suspicion would fall directly on me. His silence in court hadn't been weakness. It had been precision. Meanwhile, I sat in prison, clutching onto the faint hope that someone, somewhere, would see what I could not prove. My lawyer had stopped visiting. My friends had faded away. Yet Harris's determination grew sharper. He revisited the hospital staff's testimony. One nurse recalled Daniel's strange request to be left alone, unmonitored the night after his surgery. Another remembered how quickly he seemed to regain strength, though he remained too weak to speak. The act was unraveling. Late one evening, Harris stared at a single photograph. Daniel leaving the hospital, his expression eerily calm, almost victorious. The detective muttered to himself. He wanted her guilty. He needed her gone. And in that moment, Harris knew. Elena had been gaslit, cornered, sacrificed. Her husband's silence wasn't just cruelty. It was the final lock on her cage. But Harris also knew something else. Secrets like Daniel's never stayed buried. And if he pushed hard enough, the truth could shatter the carefully built facade. The question wasn't whether Daniel was guilty. It was how long he could keep the mask from slipping. The gavel's echo still haunted me in my sleep, though now I slept in a bed that wasn't mine, a prison cot that smelled of iron and despair. Elena was gone from the world she had once tried so desperately to protect. The verdict had buried her deeper than any grave could. And Daniel? He walked free, untouchable, cloaked in the armor of silence. Detective Harris sat restless in his office that night, files spread across his desk like puzzle pieces begging for completion. He knew, he was certain. But knowing and proving were different battles. Without Daniel's words, without a confession, the law remained blind. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the perfect alibi. Meanwhile, Daniel returned home to the house that had become a crime scene. The walls still whispered with the memory of screams, though now the neighbors no longer glanced his way. He moved through the rooms methodically, as though reclaiming territory he'd won. His shoes clicked against the polished wood until he stopped at the living room. There it was, the faint stain still visible on the floorboards, despite countless scrubbings. A reminder of the night everything had changed. Daniel crouched, fingertips brushing over the mark, eyes fixed with a hollow calm. To anyone else, it might have spoken of grief, of loss, of tragedy, but to him, it was victory carved into wood. The silence that wrapped around him wasn't heavy anymore. It was liberating. He had weaponized it, turned it into the sharpest blade, and no one had seen it coming. Elena had been painted the villain, condemned by the very man she once trusted to protect her. Her cries in court echoed still, but only in his memory, and in those echoes he found satisfaction. Detective Harris lit a cigarette outside his precinct, watching the smoke curl into the night. He wasn't done, not yet. He knew Daniel's silence hid the truth, but for now, Daniel had won. Harris whispered to himself, "The quiet ones always think they're safe, but silence cracks eventually." Inside the house, Daniel poured himself a drink, the glass trembling faintly in his hand. He raised it toward the floorboards as though toasting the ghost of his wife's freedom. No words left his lips. None were needed. His silence was his confession, his triumph, his curse. And so the house stayed still, every creak of wood and every shadow a witness, not to sorrow, not to love, but to a deadly silence that buried the truth forever.